Hello, I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about how to cite and reference the classics in APA style. Now, what are the classics? Well, the easiest way to define this is to say that there is a body of writing that has, through one mechanism or another, become broadly acknowledged at how it is divided, how it is structured, what is included in that. And while there may be some disagreement about smaller details, the larger ones are. So, for example, the Hebrew Bible has a set of books that are generally acknowledged in Jewish religious traditions. Now, there are also some things that are included in the Catholic Bible that are called apocrypha in other traditions because they looked at the Jewish communities of their time around them and said, well, hold on, they don't include that. But the existence of theirs, whether you use them as a source for, say, readings during a liturgy, while that may be a source of disagreement, their existence and how they are divided is agreed. In some cases, agreed upon by international treaty, but more often by a scholarly convention or by the agreement from a conference. And so things like the New Revised Standard Version is a descendant of the Revised Standard Version, which came about from an international meeting of scholars to try and produce the most effective and accurate English translation of the Christian Bible. Now, the Quran is similarly standardized. Many other religions and core texts are standardized in this way. But classics isn't just about religious texts. It also includes works of theology and philosophy, things like the plays of Shakespeare or the novels of Jane Austen. And while the novels of Jane Austen may be a newer source, they are still something that the division into chapters is agreed upon. We have, in some cases, Jane Austen's manuscripts. We have the editions that she was involved with during her lifetime, and so you're not going to have subdivisions of chapters. You're not going to have different verses popping up, generally speaking. So, with no further ado, let's dive in. So, if you're looking for references, great. You can always do a search online. But if you're looking for an ACU Online Writing Center resource related to one of your classes, head on over to our Writing Webinars page and take a look at this tabbed guide. If you're at the top of the page, scroll past the schedule and you'll get to this. And you can select your program here and see what tie-ins we have with your specific program. For example, CONR, you just select CONR and you can see in conflict resolution, conflict management, sorted by course number and then by week, see what tie-ins we have for you. Alright, so here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk about citation basics. We're going to specifically talk about how to cite and reference classical works in APA 7th edition. And we're going to talk about an assignment that happens to require doing this. And then we'll finish with a discussion of additional resources and helpful links. Now, I will say before we dive in that there is a fair degree of house ruling involved when working with the classics. There is a full, formal, most informative way that you can cite things in APA style, and many professors will allow you to use the common citation practice just to keep things from getting cluttered, or because they expect that it's something that you would learn if you were going deeper into this, but might not require that full rigor, that full detail for an undergraduate class. So if you are taking a course that involves working with the classics and you turn in an assignment with the full format for classical works and your professor says, just a little author date is fine, then they are telling you a house rule saying, okay, in my house, you don't need to do all that thing. You can just do the shortened version, which is fine. So let's talk citation and references in APA style. Now, there are two interrelated elements here. The first is the reference section at the end will have an entry corresponding to each published work that you refer to and cite in the text. And that serves as a guide for finding the information. Someone else could go to a library or order the specific book or go to the website where you found that information. So the reference section is filled with reference entries, again, one corresponding to each source that you reference and cite in the body of your text. Now the citations, the thing that's in the body of your paper, a citation is a shorthand entry that guides you to the full entry in the references list. And the reference entry will have a lot of stuff, but the citation is basically 2 or 3 pieces of information. Who wrote it, however many authors, is with abbreviations for conciseness, the year it was published, and if you're doing a direct quotation or wanting to point people to a very specific piece of text, to page number, paragraph number, or timestamp. For example, if we were referring to a video. Now you might ask, well, who is going in there for the author? If it's something like the Bible. And you could say, well, Moses wrote the Bible, and that would align with some of the phrasing in the Pentateuch. But there's that whole problem with Moses dying partly through, so that's not going to be a good entry for all of the Hebrew Bible, much less the Christian Bible with the Old and New Testaments. So when there is not a canonical author here, instead of putting the author of the work, we put the title of the work in italics. And in the case of a biblical translation, it might be something like the King James Bible. And so we put that in place of the author field. So let's break down those reference entries. That's going to start with who wrote it, when was it published, what is it called, how do you find it? And the how do you find it will vary depending on how it was brought to public access. But if for a book, that's going to be listing the publisher, because you can track down the publisher or track down works by the publisher. Now, if there's more than one author, you can see that we are separating them by a comma and an ampersand. Even when they're just 2 authors, we put a comma and an ampersand in between their names. You can also see that we are condensing their first and middle names, if listed, to just an initial, because this reduces author bias. The idea is that we are focusing more on the finder, the finding versus the finder. So you know someone is a famous scholar, you might view their work differently than someone who is not a name you recognize, but the goal is to let the work and the arguments and the evidence that you present speak for themselves. Now, if it's a journal article, same basic idea, but the how do you find it includes the journal title, that's Asian Perspective, the volume number, that's 31, the issue number, if there's one, that's 1, and in this case, the page range, 127 to 167. Now, some more contemporary journal publications may not give a page range because it's an electronic-only publication, so they might have an article number in place of the page range. But that's still answering the question, how do you find it? And if we're looking at a YouTube video, we will, instead of author last name and initials, we use the channel name, in this case, Jeremy Johns. It happens to correspond to the author's name, but it is published by the channel, so we attribute the channel name, whatever that is. In this case, the person named it after themselves, so it's Jeremy Johns. Now, we have, for the video content, because you might have something that's called, say, daily update, and you have a new one every day, for this kind of video content, we have not just the publication year, but also the month and the day. You'll note that we have the title of the video in italics in sentence case, with, in square brackets, that it is a video, the name of the platform, YouTube, and then a link. But again, that's getting back to our formula. Who wrote it or made it available? Well, the channel, Jeremy Johns. When was it published? 2021, on August 21st. What's called? It's called Reminiscence Movie Review. It's a video, so you know we can search for it where? On YouTube, and then here's a direct link to it. Now, if you're working with different material online, you might be working with a web publication like this, where they don't give a publication date. And so you put N period, D period for non datum, not dated. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that might come up later. So for citing it in the body of your text, we're going to be starting with who wrote it or presented it. And if that's not available, we'll put in the title in italics. When was it published? And for quotations, or when you're trying to be very specific about what's being referred to for other reasons, for example, if you're doing a Bible study, scriptural analysis, you probably want to refer to the specific chapters and verses that you will give us the page number, the paragraph number, or the timestamp. But with classics, there's another option that can go in there. Talk about that a little bit, but that's going to be an author date citation. So author and date can be in parentheses, can be, and just to note here, the bottom example is a timestamp. So the bottom left is a timestamp range, so 3 to 4 seconds. And then the bottom right is a timestamp range that happens to be just within the span of 1 second. So let's talk about those classical works here. So there's a couple pages on this in the APA's manual, but here's some key takeaway points, or key guiding rules if you prefer. Original texts that don't have an identified author are treated as having no author. But if you're looking at a published version of that has annotations, well, whoever did the annotation, which could be more than one people, will be listed as the editor of this. If there's a translator, list the translator. And most classical works before, the 16th century or so, most of those are in languages other than English. So while Shakespeare play may not necessarily have an annotator, generally speaking, there'll be some annotator involved, or some group serving as an annotator, which we don't always know. So one of the fun things in classic scholarship is who wrote the King James translation, and the people who write books, competing books, and go to conferences where they argue about that. One of the reasons why it's not listed as having a editor or annotator, because we don't know for sure. There's not international agreement on that. Now, for a classical work, which does include things like ancient Greek and Roman texts, like the plays of, let's say the works of Socrates, those are standardized in their delineations. We acknowledge, okay, this is a play, this is someone's commentary on it. Let's not mix them up. You might be looking at Euripides' plays. Again, pretty standardized. There might be some versions that are more fragmentary, but at this point, there's been a scholarly consensus for some time on what is the surviving text of that play and what isn't. Many works from before the 20th century have now been used and reused in such a fashion that we understand this is what the text is. And so because of this, they may appear in print in many forms, and we consider those to be republications of the original. And then, as I've mentioned before when we were talking about the Bible, there are certain works that have internationally standardized and agreed upon divisions, like biblical chapter and verse numbering. The poems of Dante, like the Inferno, have agreement. Okay, this is a canto. Within that, here the verse, and you'll see people agreeing on the counting there. Interesting trivia. There are some older Bible versions where they didn't agree, and this caused great confusion. So the Vulgate translation of the Bible by St. Jerome combines two very short psalms that he's like, oh, this looks like one thing. And now we recognize that those are separate in part because we've seen more Hebrew language sources like, yeah, these are clearly separate. But that means that we want to be clear which translation or version or edition we're working with so that there's not that confusion. And you won't run into that in common parlance, but if you are working with Latin versions of the Bible, then that is a significant concern to keep in mind, to make sure that you are agreeing on which translation and how that numbers things. Alright, so here's some examples. So if you're citing the King James Bible, well, you could get a published book edition, but actually take a look here. One of the things I always recommend that people do is check their sources, where they're copying the source information from another thing, or whether they're typing it up themselves. See if you can spot the typo here. There are two typos. So first, if you look at King James Bible, it says 207. Now, this was not published in the year 207. We have a typo here. Now, the King James Bible Online website, that version there went up in 2017. So we see that there is one typo there. And the second is that we are not having a correspondence between our reference entry here and the citations below because of that. So either one should catch your attention. The fact that the date is just very unlikely. What we see as English was not a thing then. What we recognize as King James came a lot after 207. So let's just fix that, and then we will continue on. And one of the most helpful pieces of advice I could give to anyone is that if you are looking through, you're looking for inconsistencies and things that just don't look right. Now we see 2017. Okay, that seems reasonable for a website. 207. That's just way too early for something in here. Especially when it says original work published in 1769. So it doesn't pass the vision test. And also looking at these citations here, those were out of alignment with what we had. Alright. Now note that because we don't know who edited this originally, or who created the King James Bible version, we don't have an author or editor listed here. Now, you might also be looking at something like, say, Aristotle's Poetics. And in this case, we have the Greek text. And there are lots of translations, so you absolutely want to indicate the translation that you used. In this case, this is one at the Internet Classics Archive, and we know the original work was published around 350. That's why it has a CA for circa, because we don't know exactly, but we know more or less when Aristotle was working, and therefore when it's likely to be written. Now, you might also be looking at, say, Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare's plays there are some different versions because more than one publication was made in or near his lifetime, and some of them reflect revisions of the play. And one of those questions you're performing is, do you do all of this version, all of that version, or a mix of both? But in general, they have become standardized. And so while you might have a scholarly edition that proposes things, that they'll be generally marked as A, B, and C for the verses, because that lets us know where they are believed to go in reference to the text that we do agree upon from the publications in the first folio, the second folio, and things like that. So here you can see this entry. We have the author, that's William Shakespeare. When this book was published, 1995, we have the title of it. Okay, this is the book publishing the play Much Ado About Nothing. The editors for this particular version, this is the editors who prepared this book that was published in 1995. And then we have a note that it was originally published in 1623. See how that was cited, and take a look at the entry in the bottom right, because you could refer to a particular portion of the text using page numbers. But what's even more useful is to tell us the act and scene division. That's Act 2, Scene 3, that's a 2 period, 3 period, and then the verses. Because then even if you have a different version of this play, you can identify, oh yes, here's the... So for example, I have a Folger Shakespeare edition, I have a friend who has a British edition, but if we give each other act, chapter, act, scene, and verses, then we can look at the same text. If I give them page numbers, my page numbers don't match up with theirs. Theirs is a giant book that has all the Shakespeare plays in it. Mine is just a small paperback copy of Much Ado About Nothing. But if we give act, scene, and verses, we know what we're talking about. So let's talk about how you might cite that. And this hinges off what I was talking about before. So you might have the three men then proceed to trick Benedict into falling in love with Beatrice. If you don't know it, we're still talking about the play Much Ado About Nothing. You can see the citation gives the original publication, and then for the modern edition we're using, and then the 2 period 3, that is Act 2, Scene 3. You could also give the page range. Now, if I tell my friend who has the exact same edition in front of them, the page range is fine. But for everyone else who has different editions, who might perhaps be looking at this online or have a handsome edition that in large type where the page numbers don't match up, number 2 isn't going to be as helpful. So in the classics fields and in courses that involve study of this, which could be in an English department, could be in a classics department, could be in many other areas for different types of texts, using the agreed upon delineations other than page numbers is very helpful. Now, if we're quoting, here's an example again. Benedict assesses his own views on marriage, stating, "One woman is fair, yet I am well. Another is wise, yet I am well. Another virtuous, yet I am well." And you can see we have the Act 2, Scene 3, and lines 27 to 29. So even without a page number, we can tell from the act and scene that this is happening in the same dramatic unit as this one here, because we have the 2 period 3 in common. Now, with this here, with the page number, you might not know where the acts and scenes begin and end with just the page numbers. And so you might not be sure if this is still the same unit of things that are happening or not. So again, number 1 is more useful. All right, let's talk about where this might come up. And so we're going to look at APCO 311. This is from the rhetorical messaging course. The assignment is involving defining and understanding rhetoric. And we see it begins with a preamble. The purpose of this assignment is to demonstrate an understanding of rhetoric through articulating its definition, to begin a rhetorical process of defining so that you will later understand that defining is itself rhetorical, and to demonstrate basic understanding of how rhetoricians have defined rhetoric over the course of its conceptualization. Now, 1 and 2 may involve your abstract reasoning, or they may involve discussing text. But number 3 is definitely going to involve discussing text of other people who've articulated thoughts about rhetoric, what it means to make an argument, or how it should be made, or how it should be understood. And if we look at the instructions for the paper, we see, okay, you have read and heard multiple definitions of rhetoric, so we're going to be having to refer to those and cite them appropriately. Interpret and synthesize at least 3 definitions of rhetoric to form what you have learned into a working definition of rhetoric. We expect that you will refine this definition throughout the term. This is a first draft. Also, keep in mind that the definition of rhetoric has been debated by scholars since ancient Greece. That is what we call a strong hint. Saying, okay, it's been debated by scholars since ancient Greece. One of your 3 or more definitions should probably be from ancient Greece. That's a very strong nudge to include that. And note that this should be 1 paragraph, and you should be citing those sources that you discuss. Second section, also paragraph, explain why we, meaning people in general, study rhetorical messages using the definition from the first section of your paper as well as examples. Oh, a little side note here. So although the instructions use the global we, as in we study, you should not be using that in APA style because that language is restricted when you're writing about your role as part of a research team. So you can say, oh, students and study this, or scholars in this field study this, that's fine. but we is considered too general to use it as in the global sense. Okay, so explain why we study rhetorical messages using the definition from the first section of your paper as well as examples. Alright, so to have examples, you're going to need to be either quoting or referring to specific delineations of text like paragraphs, verses, or some other division depending on the text that you're working with. In the third section of your paper, also one paragraph, conclude with how you could apply the study of rhetoric to everyday life. So you may or may not have citations in that, but absolutely in number 1, you're going to be giving citations for at least 3 different things, and in number 2, you're probably going to be buttressing your argument by referring to some arguments that other people have made about why this is useful, why this should be part of people's education. And if we look at the rubric for this assignment, I know it might be a little small on your screen, it's basically saying, hey, do everything that we said, make sure you have in-text citations, that's actually 15% of the grade, citations supporting your synthesis, and meeting the length requirements and all the general APA formatting for another 15%. So a lot of this is, have you done everything? You've done it in sufficient level of detail, including having at least this many definitions and citations and such. So as you are working to realize, there's some things that might be helpful. We have a whole webinar on that synthesis that is mentioned here. In the lower left-hand corner, the second row to the bottom, use appropriate in-text citations to support synthesis. Well, if you're not sure what that means, or if you're not sure how to do that for a paper of this length, we have a whole webinar about that, about adding analysis and synthesis. And I'd say that the analysis is particularly relevant for comparing different definitions of rhetoric or different arguments about how rhetoric should be used or taught. And we also have one specifically focusing on synthesis that you might be interested in. So you can find these on the Writing Center webpage, or if you're looking at the slides, just click on the links. Some things that you also might be interested in, besides the course readings, you can access many of these classics through the Internet Classics Archive maintained by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. So the text for all the works by Plato and Aristotle you can find in complete form there, for example. And I'll point out that rhetoric is discussed in several points in Plato's Republic and in Aristotle's On Rhetoric, which is, as the title might expect, the title might lead you to expect, is in fact about rhetoric. What it is, how it should be used, why it's important, etc. So those are some starting places, and if you have a source that you're not sure how to cite, whether it's from the course reading or something else, something like that, you can just write a quick, focused question to onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. Give us all the information you can. Where did you find it? Do you have a library catalog entry? Do you have a link to the website? And tell us what course and what course assignment is from, and from that we can figure out the rest and help you get to an answer. If you like feedback on your paper, rather than just a quick focused question, you can schedule an appointment. Just go to my.acu.edu on the resources drop-down, select the Online Writing Center, and follow the instructions from there. You can find our course paper template and many other resources, including a complete set of webinar videos on the Writing Center website. And with that, I bid you good night.